Good afternoon. Welcome to the second episode of the God Questions podcast. I'm Rachel Short and this is Mark Lucinius.
Hey there.
And we are a part of a church planting team that planted a church called Project 938 in the Westchester area. And we're in the midst of a series right now that we're calling the God Questions. And throughout this series, we're talking about the different questions that each one of us have about faith. So is suffering, why does suffering happen to good people? Why is science still relevant when it comes to Christianity? Is faith relevant in an age of progress? These are just some of the questions that we've been asking over the course of this series. And Mark is addressing some of those questions on Sunday mornings at church. And on Sunday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, we asked one of those questions about how the church has caused a lot of injustice in the world, and some of the points that you made on Sunday, Mark, were that the gospel, the good news of Christianity, is that the gospel creates the church, it transforms the church, it protects the church, and it releases the church. Is there anything else that you want to mention about your sermon on Sunday?
Well, sure. I think it's something that we really want to reflect on, because a lot of people could say they can either look at history or look at contemporary times or look at their own personal experience and can point to things that should be connected to the hope of the church, but have produced pain. Historically, I think it's closer to 100 to 1 as far as good to bad, and but it's still helpful to reflect on these things. For my part, there's nothing more hopeful and powerful than the local church, but without the vitality of the gospel and life of the church, I think every church is going to be vulnerable to making mistakes and hurting people. And so what we talked about this past Sunday is how the gospel is the one thing that can set the church apart from any other organization or institution in the world. And they can go back and check the message out if they want to hear how that works.
Yeah, that's great. So going on to a couple of the questions that we want to address this morning has to do with the reliability of the Bible. And so over the course of the past few weeks, we've had people text in their questions or send us emails about their questions. And a couple of those questions are having to do with how can we trust that the Bible is true? So the first question is, what would you say to someone who challenges the historicity of the Bible?
Sure. Well, I would say that they're not alone. For the last 200 years, scholarship and academics have been suggesting that we cannot trust the historical reliability of the scriptures. It started in the 19th century with sort of post-Enlightenment modernist thinking that said, well, miracles can't be true, therefore the Bible can't be true. I think a lot of that thought has gone by the wayside, but some of the remnants of that shows up every Christmas and Easter at the grocery store when you walk into the line and there's this picture of this, white version of Jesus or whatever it might be. There's this Time magazine with we got the real Jesus finally, right? And some of them are looking at some of these sort of 20th century scholars that were on the quest for the true historical Jesus. And generally speaking, what would happen with these folks is they'd say, okay, this is what we would like Jesus to be, and so we're going to keep these parts of his story in, and these are the things that either we cannot tolerate or we cannot accept based upon our own assumptions. And they would cut those things out, and they'd come up with the real historical Jesus. But most modern scholars have set aside the quest for the true historical Jesus based upon just the evidence of the scriptures themselves. Archaeology and just good historical research is proving more and more that particularly the New Testament scriptures itself on life of Jesus are really quite close to the actual events. And if you look at the gospel writings, they were written within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' life. And they, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are quoting other sources that are obviously earlier. And so if I went around started saying all these things that Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan did, and I started making up stuff about Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan, well, there'd be a lot of people who would come out and say, he didn't do that. The reason why, because it's only been 20, 30 years ago. It takes centuries to create legends, and the New Testament, particularly the New Testament writings, they are all within that first century, and they're all at a place where anyone could have stepped forward and said these things aren't true. So the historicity of the Gospels are really solid, and you can go beyond that into the rest of the writings, the New Testament, the Old Testament as well.
Yeah, and wouldn't you say, Mark, I think a question that I get a lot is on reliability of the scriptures and how I can trust the Bible. And the question that I always come back to is, was Jesus who he said he was? So, I mean, that goes right with what you were saying. I mean, because if Jesus was who he said he was, then we can trust that the scriptures are true. We can trust that he fulfilled the Old Testament in his life, and just continuing on to the New Testament as well. So I think each person who is looking at Christianity is having to ask themselves that question of, is Jesus who he said he was?
And that really was the proclamation of the first century writers. You have the Gospels that record Jesus' teaching, but when the apostles and the early believers went throughout the Roman world talking about Jesus, they didn't go out saying, okay, we got this new way of living. What they went out and said is that there's this guy who claimed to be God. He said he died and rise again, and did. And so we're out here proclaiming resurrection. And because of that, everything's different. And so our trust in the scriptures go back to, well, did that actually happen?
Yeah.
And, at one level, you could say this: if God can create the world the way it is, and if he can create the human eye and the human brain and all these amazing things, he could probably communicate himself pretty well. And if he's going to choose to use the scriptures, well, I'm sure he can do that as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So a lot of people sometimes will say things like, okay, well, the stories in the scripture are just legends. They didn't actually happen. They aren't necessarily true. I mean, they were just kind of a consolidation of the early church in order to consolidate the power and use it to manipulate people. I mean, what would you say in terms of legend theory when it comes to the scriptures?
Sure, yeah. And people like that. If you've read the Da Vinci Code or watched the movie, I thought it was a great book. But what they had to say about the Bible was just wrong. I mean, I think the basic idea, and other folks have come up with this idea that the Bible was written after Constantine became a Christian, and Christianity was then Romanized, and then they had to come up with like the basis to consolidate their power. And it really isn't true. The writings of the New Testament were from the first century, and because they were from the first century, there was no power to consolidate. These were people who were writing on the run under persecution, and they're coming from different places. And so Matthew is writing from Israel. Luke is writing from the Greek world. John was writing from the island of Patmos. The book of Mark was probably written with Peter in Rome. And so they're all written in different places and for different communities. And there was no time to consolidate power. There's no time to address discrepancies. They were just proclaiming this resurrection. And so it all kind of comes together. There was no hey, let's get a really good case. There were no bunch of lawyers in a room figuring out how we're going to make this airtight case. It was people just saying, this is what we've seen, this is what we've heard, this is what we've experienced.
Yeah, and I mean, something that you and I were also talking about is that there is a difference between precision and truth. When it comes to human authors, a lot of people can say, okay, well, but they were human authors. Human authors have error, right? And so, when we look at the 4 different accounts of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, an example that we were talking about just a few minutes ago is the feeding of the 5,000. Well, in John's account, the little boy who gave up his lunch to Jesus to feed the 5,000, he was there. But in the other accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he wasn't there, right? So the question is, is John more precise? Who knows, right? But there's a difference between precision and truth when it comes to the scriptures, particularly with human authors.
Right, and so if we were to put a witness on the stand, the demand wouldn't be for absolute precision. What we want to know is this an honest account? And I think that's what we have in the scriptures. The other thing I think we need to recognize is that the scriptures, I think we can be okay with the fact that these are human authors writing from a subjective perspective.
Yeah.
And God is okay with that. I think we can be okay with that. The flip side of it is that we also need to recognize that we as readers come to it from a subjective perspective. And so what that means is as any one of us, as somebody who wants to learn about who God is or learn about what the Bible says, we have our own perspective as we open the Bible. We might be opening the Bible saying, hey, we believe this to be true, or we want this to be true. Or we might be opening the Bible saying, we don't want this to be true. And I think it's okay to be honest about that. If you don't want the Bible to be true, there's a lot of good reasons, because if it is true, it really does change everything. But if we can at least be honest about our perspective on it, and be even open to maybe it being true, naming that on the front end helps. If we want the Bible to say a certain thing, well, let's be honest about the assumptions we bring into it. Do we want, some of us, and some would want the Bible to be sort of like Stuart Smalley from Saturday Night Live, this mirror that we can look into that says, I am good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
Right.
And who wouldn't want that? But the Bible will challenge every single culture, and so it can't necessarily fit into any particular culture.
Well, and so what would you say to the person who has some of those questions of if the Bible actually is relevant to them? I mean, there's so many different challenges in today's world, right? And everyone is searching for, okay, how do I approach these different challenges? Where does the Bible fit into that?
Well, sure. If you're hoping to read something that's going to agree with you and everyone around you about how life is, well, maybe that's not what you're looking for in the Bible. Think about, if you need some advice, sometimes going to your best friend who's in the same stage of your own life isn't necessarily the person who's going to give you the advice, because between the two of you, it's pooled ignorance. Right. And that's, I've had that situation, like, when I'm a new dad or a dad of teenagers, we look at each other like,
I don't know.
But what oftentimes, whether it's as a pastor, I need to talk to somebody outside my church, or it's even just how I parent my family, I need to talk to somebody outside my family. If we're going to understand where, what we would want to hope for in our own culture, we might need somebody from outside of our culture. If we need something that we hope for a world, well, the Bible is God's perspective from outside time, culture, and a world. And I think that is quite relevant in that it's not bound to anything that needs to be relevant.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks so much, Mark, for your time. Thanks, everyone, for listening and continuing to tune into the God Questions podcast. Obviously, these questions, we're not able to give exhaustive answers to them, but we are able to kind of do a survey and just be able to talk through a little bit of how we would approach these questions about faith. So we hope that you will join us in our next episode of the God Questions, where we'll talk a little bit more about the Old Testament versus New Testament. And if you're in the Westchester area, we would love to have you join us on a Sunday at Project 938. Mark is teaching this whole series on the God Questions, and we're addressing a little bit of the larger questions in our services on Sunday mornings, which are at Fugate Middle School at 9 a.m. and 10:30, and we would love to see you there. We'll see you next time.